Greetings and salutations. Now, I'm going to do a bit of a talk, another one, on neutralisation of binaries because a few weeks ago I did a podcast with Thoth Hermes, which I never usually do these things because I get quite nervous and I babble when I've got to do stuff like that. So anyway, all the great intentions I had of exploring the neutralisation of binaries went out the window in my stream of consciousness that I subject Rudolph to and anyone who listens to that. So I thought, as this was coming up, I'd expand upon what we began in the interview by exploring further the subject of the neutralisation of binaries, also known as the resolution of antinomies. Now, I first came across this term in Valentin Tomberg's book, Meditations on the Tarot, from whence so many things sprang. And as he also says, I believe this is a term that's peculiar to the Russian occult schools of the Silver Age, which were led by Mebes, and which reached zenith in Valentin Tomberg's own works. Now, these people, the Russians, the Martinists, and those working in Russia at the turn of the century in the Silver Age, they were greatly influenced, of course, by the French school of occultism, the Martinist school, which sprang from Eliphas Levi, and we have Papou and Joseph Heladan and others. So, in kind of recognition of the fact that Levi was a grandfather of this tradition in so many ways, I'll just quote him, where he says that a binary is a unity divided by its own power to create. Okay, a binary is a unity divided by its own power to create. And in mentioning unity, this is a really important thing to remember, because although the subject in hand, the great hermetic task, is the neutralisation of binaries in no small respect, this stems from an underlining unity, which is incredibly important. Okay, unity is the key to all of this. And I was going to quote what Valentin Tomberg says about the neutralisation of binaries. He says many things, especially in his Hermit Arcanum 9, where he points out that a binary can be neutralised in three different ways. Above, in a transcendental synthesis, which is what we're always aiming for. 2, in the horizontal, which is a compromise. And 3, below, which is a mixture. Neutralisation above takes place when one finds the neutral term on a plane higher than the plane of the binary itself. Horizontally is accomplished by finding the median term between the two terms of the binary on the plane of the binary itself. And below affected, it reduces the binary to a third term on a lower plane, and this is basically everybody arguing, probably about politics or something else on social media. So, now, in all areas of knowledge there are so-called binaries, that is the totality of two polar opposite regions. In everyday life we find binaries, and various fields of science offer us binaries such as light, shadow, heat, cold, etc. And there's a lot to unpack. This is basically the whole of hermeticism, and much to do with philosophy and so much more besides. The art of living, as Nina Roudnikova calls it, is resolving binaries. Now, metaphysicians speak of essence and substance, two goals to be studied, opposing each other. The scientists speak of principles and opposing facts. In debates, there are two contending sides. And in politics, there tend to be two warring parties, although there can be more than two. And this introduces from the outset the fact that there are an infinite number of binaries out there. Okay. A few of the great binaries that are mentioned in the books of Mebes, for example, where he's giving his students exercises and things that they need to resolve. So consciousness is on a binary scale with realizational power, which is resolved by harmony. Good and evil is presented as a binary, and I've thought a lot about what it is that could resolve the good-evil binary, and I've come up with ideas such as conscience, discrimination, universal salvation, for example, to be discussed. So while the resolution of binaries sounds like a mysterious or complicated term, it actually speaks to the whole of the Hermetic work and is based on the underlying premise that the essential unity of all that exists precedes every act of knowledge, and every act of knowledge presupposes the tenet of the unity of the world. So we have to approach this with a very definite sense of unity, of union, of universality, where the cosmos is to be understood as an organic whole, where binaries serve to achieve a synthesis, a resolution or neutralisation of all opposing factors until an eternal divine unity is achieved. This is a definition we're getting from Giordano Bruno, and all the great primordial philosophers or philosophers who are engaged in the primordial work will be looking at this. The principle of reconciling opposites, as we learn in the Gospel of Philip, is light and darkness, life and death, right and left are mutually dependent. It is impossible for them to separate. Restoration to unity allows the mystic to transcend the illusion and perceive spiritual reality. So this idea of the neutralisation of binaries, although it comes up with these Russian Silver Age mages, this is actually a very ancient idea. It's as old as the whole of this work, this tradition. And if we think about some of the other terms that it's known by, as well as the resolution of antinomies, we've got the alchemical wedding, the marriage of sun and moon, heaven and earth. The Gnostic Valentin's concept of syzygy, very important. The Coincidentia Oppositorum of Nicholas of Cusa and Giordano Bruno, and the Mysterium Conjunctionis of C.G. Jung. And actually Jung, I love his book, The Mysterious Conjunction, and I think it's his best work, and in this he's talking about, he has a marvellous analysis of the Assumption of the Virgin as the ultimate mystical expression of the alchemical marriage, and also demonstrating that within these great Christian, Catholic mostly, concepts we have a living expression of the primordial faith. Jung's work is full of binaries, and he sees these at work in the human psyche as animus, anima, male, female, stating that the self is made manifest in the opposites and the conflicts between them. It is coincidentia oppositorum, hence the way to the self begins with conflict. So this coincidentia oppositorum is the core teaching of all Hermetic philosophy, the coincidence of opposites or conjunction of contraries. What that means is that the part and the whole share an essential identity or affinity, which in latter days came to be called participation mystique. And I believe there was a precedent in Heraclitus, who also taught the coincidence of opposites. And he was considered an outlaw spirit, Heraclitus, in the context of early Greek rationalism. In fact, he was called Heraclitus the Dark or the Obscure. In more modern times, we might recognise this whole as the basis of the Hegelian dialect, whilst Gnostic theology is, of course, replete with binary motifs, although they might not perhaps come back to the unity in all cases. Now, the example from Gnosticism which I immediately thought of in this context is in the thunder perfect mind, which demonstrates the apparently contradictory essence or nature of the divinity, which is both creative and destructive. I am the honoured one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am without God, and I am she whose God is magnificent. And this concept of having a destructive and a creative divinity we see, of course, in ancient Indian philosophy, Brahma and Shiva with Vishnu holding the balance of harmony between them. And then we've got the Gnostic concept of syzygy from Valentinus, the male-female pairings which form the eons, and this is also a term which Jung uses to describe the anima-animus union. And then we've got Mircea Eliade, the philosopher, who also explores the theme of opposites, especially the sacred and the profane, and that's a good binary. And he talks about these as not being dualistic but paradoxical, and bringing us to the region where language fails, which is actually incredibly perceptive of him, because if we remember Meditations on the Tarot, where our learning of the neutralisation of binaries began for so many of us, and he's talking about the gift of black perfection, drawing light from darkness. In other words, to fully resolve all these binaries that are in the great work, we have to go beyond what is known, which is represented by the light of the two poles, good, evil, etc., to the realm beyond them, into intuition, the realm where it's darker, where we have to find our way and we have to draw light from that darkness as we attempt to achieve the transcendental synthesis, which is the neutralisation of the binaries and the return to unity. Now, speaking of unity, the important Russian philosopher Vladimir Solovyov was a crucial influence on our Silver Age magicians, and utilised the term syzygy to express the idea of a closer union. He was actually declared a heretic for his views on Sophia, but he was still incredibly influential to this entire school. It's worth reflecting on this as we attempt to understand the thinking of our Russian mages. Solovyov, he's underpinning them all and helps us to see the extent to which they cooperated to achieve a unified philosophy in a way that perhaps the French and the English of this era and earlier eras did not. Perhaps they became more competitive or argued amongst themselves, whereas our Russians really did unify. Perhaps it was something to do with the times they were living in, at the turn of the century in Russia, just over 100 years ago, on the eve of revolution. These people stuck together for the most part until they were betrayed. But the ones that we're involved with studying, they stuck together, and this unity enabled them to achieve so much more together. They wanted to reconcile all branches of knowledge, philosophy, theology, and so on into a single system, which is described as the synthetic philosophy, which Rudolph tells me derives from the French term synthetique, and quite different to the English understanding of synthetic. Our understanding is different there. And the same actually can be said of the term cliché, which also appears often in these Russian works with respect to astral forms and the development of egregores, astral clichés. So the doctrine of infinities, or coincidentia oppositorum, is the basis of the magical structure of consciousness and of shamanism. It's a way of knowing through empathetic identification. This was taught as well by Nicholas of Cusa, who lived from 1401 to 1464, whose De Docta Ignorantia, his book on learned ignorance, lays out the teaching of the affinities and the coincidence of opposites, whose core teaching is contained in the saying that God is a circle whose centre is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere, or the identity of the part and the whole, which makes knowledge of the whole by the part possible at all. This is the shape of magical consciousness, and that is what Bacon was referring to in his opposition of science and magic. By science or the experimental philosophy, he meant objective knowledge, knowledge of the phenomena gained by experiment and observation. By magic, he meant knowledge of essences attained by immediate insight through empathetic identification, now come to be called mysticism. Now, I did make a note to myself here about the difference between the noumenal and the phenomenal, and the schism in the soul that is caused by incarnation. That's something I might return to later. Now, just to jump back again to Tomberg and others, our magicians, our mages, Mebes, we're taught that the means to achieve the neutralisation of binaries is by the method of analogy, because this is no easy task, and by analogy it can help us to make the connections necessary to get our way back up this triangle. Recognising the relationship of all things and beings gives us a means of acquiring knowledge by the method of analogy. I think also Papu talked about this. At the root of the diversity of phenomena, their unity is found in a way that shows them to be both different, i.e. not identical or heterogeneous, but analogous, and in kinship with each other. The Emerald Table sets out the classic formula of analogy, which everyone will recognise. That which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. So this gives us a starting point in more ways than one. It highlights one of the essential binaries, above and below, heaven and earth, and also provides us with the method of analogy that will help us achieve a resolution. Symbolism is a method of analogy applied to a particular case, and of course the whole of the tarot arcana are symbols. And they also contain binaries within them, especially the second decad, which hopefully I'll mention somewhere later on in this, because in Shmakov's work it's a decad system. So the first 10 arcana, starting with the magician up to the wheel, they are paired with the second 10, starting with force in this system. So force is number 11, so this gets paired with the magician, who's number 1, and going up to the judgment, number 20, paired with the wheel. Now, the second 10 decad, starting with force, these are binaries, these are vortices, and in most cases these vortices are expressed on the tarot images themselves. Think about the angel with 2 vases pouring water into the streams, or the devil with the 2 slaves in front of it. Now, Cusa described how the intellect insatiably desires to attain unto the truth through scrutinising all things by means of its innate faculty of inference. Mebes, he describes the process in great detail, because the resolution of binaries and the method of analogy, this is how he kicks off the whole thing in his Tarot Majors, in the Magician Arcanum. And it's very important, it runs all the way through the work as a recurring theme. And it's also an important foundation of the Tarot Minors, where the first 6 arcana of coins are very much concerned with this matter. This is a great teaching in the Minors, because they're more abstract, they're simpler to understand, and they constitute more of the practical work to be done by the initiate, and they're also very much engaged with the male-female binary. Yep, it is a binary. Still is the binary, and resolving it is done spiritually. Now then, one of the things that Mebes says in Magician is present some examples of binaries, also explaining that neutralising the great spirit matter binary is the first step on the path to initiation. So that's no small thing. And in this case, the resolution between spirit and matter is an astral energy, he teaches. And those who are familiar with the work of Mebes, the Tarot Mages, is very much occupied with astral forces. It's very occult, and it's in the astral plane, the work that's been done in the Tarot Mages. The midway point between the physical and the spiritual, or mental, if you prefer. And this is at the top of the evolutionary triangle. And he also, because of this, given that we do have the physical on one side and the mental and spiritual on the other, a healthy mind, a healthy body, a healthy soul, they must all be in harmony. These things, a healthy body and a healthy mind for a healthy astrozone. The other example he gives here that's very important is consciousness and realizational power, which is resolved by harmony. And now at this point, I sort of interject that to correctly neutralise binaries, you have to correctly define your terms. You have to correctly set your binaries. Now, I'll turn to the Solar Way and Nina Roudnikova, because she makes much of this very important fact, especially in the second arcanum, the High Priestess. Nina was the High Priestess, really, of this whole school. And she points to the fact that so much confusion is caused and argument is caused by the incorrect setting of binaries, which we see all the time in politics, where, one is red, one is blue, one's pretending to be Labour or Republican, the other one Conservative or Democrat, and basically they're just, in a homogeneous mess. They're not actually true binaries. So to try and discriminate between them as if they were binaries will lead to a lot of confusion, a lot of arguing, and you'll never resolve it. She points to a false binary that's as being life and death, and saying that actually the correct binary in this case, as a simple example, would be birth and death. And I would argue that they are resolved by life itself. So life is in there, but it's at the upward point of the triangle. It's not on the horizontal plane in this case. Yeah, and I've said here, the world about us is basically everyone's set at false opposition to everybody else, divide and conquer. And there's problems of the ego and of ignorance, and this is where this ability to go into the realm of the unknown, beyond the fixed, what is known, into this land of darkness, to draw light from the darkness, is so important in this work. And to do this, we have to use our personal discrimination and intuition, which grows the more we do the work. Vladimir Shmakov also addresses this issue of false binaries and how this is a tactic that's used to control people. From above, he quotes Lenin, who said, "If you want to control opposition, you run it yourself." Controlled opposition. The correct setting of binaries, on the other hand, as I already mentioned at the start, Nina Roudnikova describes as the art of living. There we go. Birth, death, with the art of living in between them. And there's a discrepancy, eagle-eyed people will notice, because Mebes himself does present life and death as a binary. Now, I think, given that Nina Roudnikova was his pupil, and given that the Tarot Mages was not written by Mebes himself, but transcribed by his pupils from lecture notes, I believe he set this as an exercise, because he's always setting them exercises throughout the course, because he was a teacher, a professor in St. Petersburg, and it's likely that he gave them binaries to resolve so that they might figure it out for themselves, as, of course, Nina did, being the star pupil. So we see, as we progress through the work of this chain, as they call themselves, this Russian chain, that each subsequent link in that chain does refine the work of those who went before them. So from Mebes we get to Nina Roudnikova, and Nina then initiated Valentin Tomberg, and so we have, and he then synthesizes to an even more finer and even subtler synthesis, and makes it profoundly more Christian in Meditations on the Tarot than we have in any of the other works, and he gets to the pinnacle It's an upward progression. This is the peak of the thrice great triangle of emeticism, mysticism, Gnosticism, and magic. So mentioning Nina Roudnikova brings us to the High Priestess Arcanum. I've already mentioned she was this, where naturally the work of resolving binaries really takes shape. And we see this in the image of the card. I don't have it to hand, but I'm sure you can remember it, where the priestess with her two horns or double tiara is sitting between the two columns. And if we think of the two columns of the Tree of Life, Joachim and Boaz, the High Priestess is occupying the middle pillar of this. So the Tree of Life itself expresses the polarity of mercy and severity, harmonised through the middle pillar, the way of beauty. And the human being is tasked with resolving the binaries as shown by this card. Realising power. And the process of moving from magician to high priestess is in itself an exercise in harmonisation and resolution. Now here I wanted to introduce another concept very central to this work. Also will be recognised by students of the French school, which is the tetragrammaton, a pivotal axis around which this wheel turns. And the letters of the tetragrammaton, the yod, the hey, the vowel, and the second hey. And in this system, in addition to each arcanum being ascribed a Hebrew letter in order of the alphabet, the first four arcana in particular are associated with the four tetragrammaton letters. And then to produce the Redeemer cliche, as it's called, we insert the letter Shin, which is the full arcanum. So back to our meeting of the magician with the high priestess. The yod and the hey, the yod of the magician meets the hey of the priestess, and they produce the third term, the vow, which becomes the empress, the child of this union of yod and hey. The second hey is then the emperor, and whenever the wheel is set in motion, the axis of the wheel turns, and the second hey of one cycle becomes the yod of the subsequent cycle, like an equinox between winter and spring, or summer and autumn, a pivotal point. And on the subject of the vow itself, just getting a bit deeper into Kabbalah, if you read the Shara Ora, the Gates of Light of Joseph Gikatilla, vow is on the middle pillar. And I've said this before in my presentations, and I'll say it again because it's important to remember that this letter vow is in the middle pillar position, and it runs through Da'ath, where the covenant between God and humanity is reached in Da'ath. So why focus on resolving binaries? I described it as the key emetic task, which features highly in all the emetic masterworks, but it also speaks to the problems and paradoxes of not just our age, but every ages, because these binary forces are embedded into the principle of life on Earth, both in the lofty metaphysical realms and in the physical. Spirit, form, birth, death, consciousness, power of realisation, Republican, Democrat, if that's not the true binary, Catholicism, communism, Brexit, Remain, male, female, yeah, it's everywhere, isn't it? And we have to find a solution to all of these things in a harmonious way, which enables us to evolve as a race and not get bogged down in that downward argument, that mixture, that unholy mixture. Thinking again about our mages, whilst the resolution of binaries is introduced early in Mebes, and then in the High Priestess, Indian and Roudnikova, for Tomberg it's in the Hermit, which underscores the fact it is the emetic task. And the ninth arcanum is the method and essence of emeticism, founded on the concordance of three methods of knowledge: the a priori knowledge of intelligence, the lamp, the harmony of all analogy, the mantle, and the authentic immediate experience, which is the staff. Emmetism is thus a threefold synthesis of three antinomies: idealism, realism, faith and empirical science, and realism, nominalism. So you see realism appears twice, and remember we said at the beginning how there's an infinite number of binaries, and just because one term has a binary with another, like idealism, realism, that doesn't preclude it having another binary, such as realism, nominalism, or the general versus the particular, humanity versus man, the problem of universals, which was resolved in the spiritual history of mankind by the fact of the incarnation of the Messiah Jesus Christ, where the fundamental universal of the world, the Logos, is the Christ, becomes the Christ, and who is the fundamental particular of the world, the universal of universals. Tomberg, by the way, I've just put in a little note here, teaches that the inverted tetragrammaton, which I won't pronounce, is the arcana of empirical science, reducing quality to quantity. So he's taking a dim view of this, as he would with a lot of technology, I think, even though we're all addicted to it, including me, sadly. Computers, not phones. I hate my phone. If you add the qualitative, you get the vertical bar of the cross, which is faith and religion. So faith and religion is like this, and then empirical science. Now, I mentioned at the beginning the gift of black perfection. It's not about finding a resolution to those antinomies that please everyone, but it's more about encouraging the spiritual endeavour which resolution involves. Shmakov expands on this theme insofar as he stresses the importance of approaching the attempted resolution with the totality of our being. In order to perceive the farthest reaches of the poles, we must strive for this. Without that, we will fall short of the desired synthesis. We have to really stretch the boundaries of our mind here. And stretch our own, go beyond our ego and what we want to see and what we don't want to see. On a mundane level, we see this failure every day in the arguments between political parties and between people on any matter you can think of, where neither can see the actual point or the pole of the other, or if they do see it, they don't actually want to resolve it, or they won't see. Yeah. So it's the idea of denying that there's any truth in the opposition is before us every day, and it's not going to give, if we try and resolve it along those lines, if we basically say, it's my way or the highway, and there is no alternative, there is no opposing idea, you're never going to get that. You're never going to get that triangle. You're not going to synthesize, and you're not going to go back to a place of unity, because you can't just leave all that behind, deny that it's there, because it's there. The endeavour to draw light from the darkness, which is beyond the light of the two poles, an effort to attain knowledge which appears to be not only unknown but unknowable. The gift is transcendent knowledge, spiritual knowledge. We want spiritual knowledge. We don't just want to resolve arguments, we want to get to a higher plane of understanding, which will bring us closer to the God, closer to our own reintegration through the earth. Remember? Every serious antinomy signifies psychologically, according to Tomberg, the light that I possess is polarised at two poles. Between these two luminous poles there is only darkness. It is from this darkness that the solution to the antinomy, the synthesis, must be drawn. It is necessary to create light from darkness. Fiat lux, let there be light. And he draws a distinction between types of darkness, one of them which is ignorant, lazy, passive, infralight, or the darkness of higher knowledge, ultralight, the silence, the sound of the silence. And then we've got a few easy binaries that can help us, using the method of analogy, father, mother, resolved by the child, such as the yod, he, thou, remember? Light and darkness resolved by twilight, the bridge of twilight, enables you to go through the magical door when you can find that exact moment when twilight or dawn are there. That is the eye of the needle. Sun, Moon, Mercury. So, using these more simple examples can help us when we're trying to resolve the much more complex matters that we have in hand. And then Tomberg again, because we're still in the Hermit card here, insofar as it's a synthesis, a personal one, of course, for the inner forum of the consciousness of each, in which the 3 antinomies above supply each time the 3rd term. Its number is 9, and it's the 9th arcanum of the tarot, which teaches about the 3 syntheses of the 3 antinomies, realism, nominalism, etc. So, all this binary business, actually, people will have perceived, and Rudolph himself pointed out, that it's all leading to triangles. It's all about triangles. The ternary, the 3rd principle, the Holy Trinity, Trismegistus, mysticism, Gnosticism, magic, the Holy Trinity, Holy Father, Holy Son, Holy Spirit, Holy Mother, Holy Daughter, Holy Soul, the upward triangle, transcendental synthesis, the 3-fold scale. Which shows the unity we're talking about in the diversity, and bringing them into harmonious resolution. So in special subjects it's quite easy to find the neutralisation, light, dark, shadow, etc. The medium way, therefore establish a 3-fold scale. So I'm just reading my notes here. Between light and shadow is a penumbra, revealing the degree of illumination. Or between hot and cold, you've got intermediate temperatures. Talk about electricity and positive negative currents. But not all binaries can be neutralised easily. We've got a binary called essence and substance, neutralised by nature. Then we've got spirit, matter, the astral plane, birth and death, good and evil. Now this is one which is particularly pointed out as a difficult one. How do you reconcile good and evil? Perhaps this is in some ways the greatest of them all, because every day in our lives we're presented with the most wonderful instances of good things happening, but also terrible things happening to good people. And how do we reconcile the fact that this is happening? I personally don't think that karma is quite fair in this respect, even though it comes into it. But as I said earlier, conscience, I think, does come into it. And I think also the idea of universal salvation. And when I reflected on the problem of resolving the good-evil binary, when I was in the middle of reading up on all this and kind of thinking about it in bed at night, when all the best ideas occur to me, when I haven't got anything to write them down, and I considered the good-evil binary and how this really was a kind of a huge universal and problem for humanity, it occurred to me that if you put together every human soul, you have everything that appears on this binary scale, because everybody is somewhere on this line between good and evil. And for everyone who's this good, there's somebody who's this bad. And for everyone who's this good, there's somebody who's this bad. So if you consider that there's that many souls, and that they fill this entire space between the two poles, perhaps a way to climb the ladder becomes more apparent, that this is truly a group work. A group in the sense of the whole of humanity. And that's why I arrived at the idea of universal salvation being the transcendent way of resolving this. Now some might say, well, why should everyone on this evil binary, on the evil side, be included in this universal salvation? And I think I was finding my way, and this is not a simple to resolve matter, but where I was inclining towards is, if you think, okay, these are the furthest poles of good and evil, and let's say that the vast majority of people, pretty much everybody, are somewhere in the middle, whether that be on the good side or the evil side. Everybody, therefore, if they're not on the farthest limit of the evil, then that means they must have an element of good in them, because they're being drawn towards that other side. And this element, I believe, would be resolved by the universal salvation. It's what is good in us all will be saved. In this, by the same token, what is not good, but is more on towards the good pole, what is not meeting the ultimate high standard will be rejected and left behind, so that the portion of us will either be greater or lesser in what is saved. As for the furthest reach of the evil binary, that would be a concept, relate to a concept which has come up in the past in my Hermetic studies about the redemption of Lucifer, where there's a sense that the perfect intelligence of Lucifer cannot help but recognise the injustice of Christ being crucified, because the intelligence is perfect and it has to recognise the truth, and that once that awakening occurs, Lucifer henceforth will herald Christ. Okay, and that's the redemption from that side. Okay, it's my thought for the day, or the night. Now, kind of my notes have got a little bit more patchy. I've got a highlighted bit from Nina Roudnikova, where she says the philosophical principle of Arcanum 1, the magician, is that of a single static space, and Arcanum 2, the high priestess, is of eternal boundless movement, i.e. time, space and time. And in the manifested world, to reiterate, each phenomenon must be considered as having two poles, positive centripetal, active, negative centrifugal, objective or passive, in relation to the subject's environment or influence. The goal of human life is liberation from duality through its cognition, she says. True love is spiritual unity. In his quest for liberation from differentiated forms, man must connect the poles of his spiritual attitude during his journey through the manifested world. Only by solving the problem of integrating the two into the common principle that unites them can the correct path from form to spirit be found. Otherwise, some of the forms of the counterpole, if not found, can be taken for the incomprehensible divine principle, and this will close the only possibility of reaching the truth. So the problems of the human spirit and its search are reduced to the correct setting of the poles. Poles that are correct in relation to each other are the binaries. And she gives us some correct binaries. Unmanifest, manifest. Infinite, finite. Evolution, involution. Impersonal, personal. Centrifugal, centripetal. Spirit, form. Incorrect binaries lead to philosophical confusion and form a fantastic worldview that does not correspond to cosmic reality. And then she does actually say that absolute good and absolute evil are relative, which we've just been exploring. And then she explores a little bit centrifugal, centripetal, because this will evoke the idea of a torus field. People who like Tesla and torsion and magnetism and infinity signs and all these all these great things that scientific people and physicists will describe much better than me. So from the centre to the periphery, centripetal, and vice versa, centrifugal, are the two currents that are apparent on all planes of manifestation, reflected in the spiritual life of a person. Centripetal is reflected esoterically by wisdom, the second exoterically by the worship of God. Centripetal force is at the heart of religion, the basis of the search for truth, of a free will and self-standing spirit. But each religion is revealed by the cult worship of God. Intellectual life is also dual. On the one hand, the man's mind strives for recognition and analysis of the objective world, science, and on the other, man wants to know his own synthetic formula, and synthesizing the acquired knowledge according to the aspiration reshapes it into self-consciousness, philosophy. The duality of psychic life reveals itself through self-affirmation and self-denial, of course, the ringer we put ourselves through. The first is the search for truth, the second on service of the common good. And the great duality of the embodied life is the division into two sexes. There is a binary man-woman, which in its final form contains, symbolises and embodies all the duality of the manifestation of the world. This is why this issue is very important for emetic studies. Now we start talking about theosophical ternaries, and the theosophical ternary is archetype man and nature, archetype man nature, or archetype nature man, divine essentia, life, natura naturans. We can apply this to the Empress, the third arcanum, divine nature, birth, generation. The idea of creation is linked to the idea of lover and attraction. Attraction of opposites, some might say. The Empress, again we're reminded, neutralises the first two arcana as the androgyne, the vow, the middle pillar. Now I've put this in capitals, this bit. I wrote all this about a month or so ago, that's why I'm getting a little bit sketchy, but still. Humanity connects nature with the archetype, and this ternary is the life of the universe, the absolute, and is totally harmonious, androgynous, omniscient, well-blessed, possessing total capacity of action, and therefore can limit the sphere of activity. This common principle, using the common expression, is divided into active and passive manifestations and is an ascending triangle. Now, we got into the past, the present and the future, and how the present is the resolution of the past and the future. And I was kind of making a series of analogies. For example, we take the binary consciousness and realizational power, resolved by harmony. In the consciousness column, we've got the magician, the first arcanum, the yod, and the column of mercy. The realizing power, the hay, we have the feminine high priestess principle, and the pillar of strength. In the third, the resolving, the third term, we have harmony, we have the androgyne, the blending of male and female, the vow, and the pillar of beauty. Between mercy and strength, the pillar of beauty. Now, in great big letters, I've written time, just time. Without indicating the moment we call the present, we are unable to distinguish between past and future. The moment determines these areas by its own location. Therefore, past and future both emanate from the present. past is inert and passive as it cannot be altered, whereas the future is active and can change depending on the progression of the moment. Archetype is in the present. Nature, fate, that which is set in stone is in the past. And humanity is in the future by freedom and the collective will. So we will argue with Fabre d'Olivet that world history is based on a mystical triangle where we have fate and the will of mankind resolved by providence. So providence with the present and the archetype. Fate with the past and nature, and the will of mankind with humanity and the future. Which I'm thinking is a very good place to kind of wrap this up, because if I'm looking at my notes, I then go into the Kybalion and the principle of gender, which I think you all know pretty well. And I then move on to the transmission quaternary. Which is from Shmakov. I'll read this out from Mr. Complicated, just in case, just as we wind down. When the noumenon begins to manifest itself in a certain aspect, it first of all objectifies, outlines this aspect in its own being. It focuses on it and thereby causes a potential difference corresponding to this aspect to be. At the same time, according to the law of analogy, a potential difference is also objectified in the median, which is analogous and binurnal to its noumenal prototype. This is expressed by the law. The spirit is able to assert in itself an infinite number of potential differences, and all of them are always positive, that is, active. They are also real, as they are able to give energy equivalents. The medium is also able to detect potential differences, but they are always negative, that is, passive. They are imaginary, that is, unable to give equivalents. Thus the spirit is able to reveal from itself an infinite number of forces and actors, while the environment reveals only voids and spaces for the manifestations of the spirit. These spaces or voids only but always accompany the corresponding impulses of the spirit, but cannot arise by themselves, because otherwise the environment itself would turn out to be a substantial force. Invariably following the manifestations of the active spirit, it carries out its manifestations on the one hand, and on the other, implements the principle of stagnation of energy, he says see Arcanium 11, which is expressed by the traditional formula, nature is afraid of emptiness, or nature abhors void. When both potential differences have arisen, then gravity arises between them, as between the polar terms of the binaries. Two processes take place here. On the one hand, each of these pairs generates vortices with a common axis, and on the other, both of these vortices begin to approach each other, and throughout this path, the potential differences, that is, the shoulders of the pairs, remain perpendicular to each other until the ultimate moment of the merger of both vortices, the onset of which marks the confirmation of the manifestation of the spirit. In this last stage, the difference between the potential differences drops to zero. the two vortices merge into one, which is an exhaustive phenomenal representation of the noumenon aspect, acting further on the medium as a self-sufficient triune force. The above is the true answer to the riddle of the Sphinx proposed to Oedipus, which is the first half of the quaternary doctrine. The quaternary is the noumenal law of the assertion of support, the transfer of the power of the noumenal centre to the environment through the generation of an impulsive source in it. The manifest noumenon generates a pair in itself, which entails the generation of a pair in the environment. These two pairs form a transmission quaternary, pulling together with each other along the binurnal attraction. They lower the noumenal vortex into the plane of the medium. In the first stage, the noumenon is confirmed in 4. When combining pairs, the noumenon is confirmed in 2. In the final stage, the noumenon turns into a triune self-sufficient force. This third stage, when the spirit is established on 3 levels, is the final one in relation to it, because from this moment on, further manifestation follows the law of the phenomenal quadrupolar quaternary, an idea expressed by the traditional pentacle. With the help of this quaternary, the spirit flows eternally into the environment, which makes the fluidity of nature in the aspect of permanent synthesis and is the source of its own transformations according to the laws that already lie in its aspect. Every force has a potential difference as its source. The whole known world is the world of energy, and all forms of phenomena are its various modifications. The world of reason, as a set of binaries, is in turn the world of the same energy, and it is this sign that tactfully points to their identity, to the fact that thinking is creativity. Living in the world of form, time, and measure, man feels himself in the mind, and therefore the goal of all knowledge, whatever its form, is the transformation of its data into the mind. But no matter where a person goes, no matter where he aspires, he feels the attraction of the unknown and incomprehensible with his whole being. This unknown, the ultimate root cause of all things, is separated from man by the edge of a host of cosmic contradictions. The more a person strives for it, the more boldly these contradictions argue with each other, the more complex and vast the binaries of universal synthesis become. This incomprehensibility of the deity is a consequence of the powerlessness of the human being to pacify and connect binaural ideas about him in his mind. Deity is a synonym for the totality of the entire mass of world contradictions. So that's it. That was from Shmakov, the incomparable Shmakov, the brain box of the whole school. Okay, so that's it. That's my kind of whole stream of consciousness surrounding, not my whole, actually, what I put down on paper a few weeks ago relating to the neutralisation of binaries, which we've been exploring several times, including in the tourbillons and the vortices talks that I gave earlier in response to a request. So we've got to keep this in our mind, because all around us in this world there are contending and opposing forces trying to drag us one way or another, but our goal should be to stay in the centre, to resolve them harmoniously in an upward synthesis, to produce the caduceus of Hermes from our tree of life, and to remain in the point of potential, in the middle pillar, the pillar of beauty, the pillar of vow, the way to the earth, and our reintegration with the divine, the Godhead, the triune Godhead at the top. Okay. Good luck. see you there. Hopefully.